The Chinese civilization, although younger than those in the Middle East, rightly holds the title of one of the oldest still thriving today. However, when we mention 4,000 years of Chinese history, it's essential to recognize that this refers to the histories of various states that often coexisted, engaged in conflicts, yet shared a common culture and continuity. As early as the first millennium BC, during the Warring States period, the Chinese were already crafting straight steel swords. The treatise on the art of war, or rather the laws of war, written around the same time, is still a fundamental part of officer training programs in many countries today. While there's a trend among so-called alternative researchers to downplay and question the achievements of the Chinese, an incredible amount of archaeological evidence suggests that people in this region have been around for a very long time and were clearly not savages. By the way, the idea that there were arrow slits in the Great Wall of China aimed at China is just an old myth. In fact, Japan borrowed almost everything from China, from writing and metallurgy to traditional clothing. In the first millennium AD, it was incredibly prestigious for the Japanese to go to China to study. Up until the 10th century, Japan's cold weapons were basically copies of those widely used in China and Korea. Thanks to Western cinema, the katana has become quite famous and is one of the incarnations of the single-edged Chinese Dao blades. The classic Chinese Dao weapon was actually most similar to the European falchion, with the slight note that it appeared about a century earlier. Typically, weapons with single-edged Dao blades had specific names. For instance, the Guandao is a large saber, resembling something like a European glaive. The Changdao is a long two-handed sword, while the Jianma Dao is a horse-slicing sword, a massive two-handed weapon. Chinese cold weapons were incredibly diverse, but, as we know, every civilization has its periods of rise and fall. China hit its peak in the mid-19th century, when silk, porcelain, and other goods from the Middle Kingdom were selling quite well in Europe. At the same time, China was in no rush to open its markets to Europeans, realizing that such a move wouldn't benefit its own producers. In response to this policy, the British Empire started flooding the Chinese market with opium smuggled in, turning a significant portion of the population and about a third of the officials into addicts. This, in turn, sparked a military conflict that ultimately resulted in China becoming a dependent state, leading to decline and poverty. Japan, facing a similar situation, was luckier and managed to navigate through it. The second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were a time when the only thing saving China from complete division was the sheer number of countries wanting to take part in that division. In fact, after the Japanese were denied a piece of Chinese land and the Russian Empire occupied Manchuria, the Russo-Japanese War began. By the beginning of the 20th century, China was a sad sight. Its own production was virtually non-existent. The main source of industrial goods was European imports, which were inaccessible to the impoverished peasantry. Metallurgy consisted of hundreds of small blacksmiths, meaning it lagged behind Europe by many centuries. Now China is the global leader in steel production, producing more than all the countries of the European Union, Japan, the United States, India, and Russia combined. Back then, such results were nothing more than a dream. The period from the defeat in the Opium Wars to the mid-20th century is known as the Century of Humiliation. Just when the Chinese thought they had hit rock bottom, in 1931, a knock came from below, or rather from the east. Japan decided once again to expand its territories. China was not only poor, but also embroiled in internal conflicts. Against the backdrop of prolonged poverty and external control, leftist movements began to gain momentum, although they wouldn't proclaim the People's Republic of China until nearly 2 decades later, in 1949. Strangely enough, the country that is now vying for the title of the world's largest economy had almost no firearms 90 years ago. The task of equipping the Chinese army with weapons fell to those same medieval small blacksmiths. The Japanese were armed with Arisaka rifles, machine guns, and officers also carried katanas, which were often used more as execution tools. Generally, the Japanese did not take prisoners, and the civilian population was frequently targeted as well. In response to this arsenal, one type of Dao emerged, referred to in some sources as the Dadao, which translates to big blade. The troops armed with this weapon were called Dadao Duai. This weapon only appeared in the second half of the 19th century and was unique in its own way. Essentially, it was something akin to a cleaver and a saber, with an overall length of up to 85 centimeters, making it even shorter than some European one-handed swords. It featured a two-handed grip and had a relatively short blade of up to 50 centimeters. The weight of the weapon was around 2 kilograms, meaning it was essentially the length of a one-handed European sword, with a blade similar to that of a short gladius. However, with a weight comparable to European 1.5 or even some two-handed swords, the secret behind such a substantial mass is quite simple. The spine of the dado blade reached nearly 1 centimeter in thickness. This thick, tapering blade with a center of gravity shifted toward the tip made the cleaver an excellent chopping weapon. The two-handed grip, combined with the short blade, allowed for fairly quick strikes despite its considerable weight, though it did come at the cost of striking distance. A short, thick blade resembling a sharpened block of metal is much more reliable than long-bladed weapons. You could easily chop wood with it, or even dig trenches if needed. In Western media, the Dadao earned the nickname katana killer. This is linked to the fact that Japanese rifles had a relatively low rate of fire. They had to be pulled off the shoulder for reloading. Chinese troops preferred to strike at night or from ambush, quickly moving into close combat. Chinese troops often used grenades to disorient their enemies, then charged in to force close combat. If the opponent was armed with a katana or a rifle with a bayonet, the Chinese fighter would typically strike diagonally from below, aiming to hit the enemy's weapon first. Then, with a swift motion from above, they would target the opponent themselves. Deflecting such a strike with a soft block was quite challenging. The clash between the short, broad Dadao and the katana usually didn't bode well for the latter. Perhaps the most successful operation by armed Chinese troops took place at the Battle of Happy Peak in 1933. At that time, 500 soldiers from the 29th Army of China, primarily armed with Dadao and some pistols, launched a surprise attack on a Japanese camp, wiping out over 1,000 soldiers and seizing a handful of trucks loaded with ammunition and machine guns. The next day, the Japanese decided to take revenge and launched an attack. However, the Chinese waited in their trenches and charged when the enemy got close. After losing 700 soldiers, the Japanese were forced to retreat. Following this battle, a march dedicated to the Dadao emerged. Though some might point out that in the 20th century, the katana wasn't the primary weapon of the Japanese, and those that were made were likely factory-produced, probably falling short of the medieval standards. But it's important to understand that most likely a short and hefty block of forged steel, after all, the Chinese were no amateurs when it came to blacksmithing, could probably shatter any katana. And it really doesn't matter whether the Japanese fighter faces the opponent's blade with the edge or the back. On YouTube, you might have seen a German show where a katana surrenders to a slightly heavier European arming sword, which sparked quite a few debates. However, it's quite likely that the Dadao could come out on top in a direct confrontation with this European weapon. Overall, even though the nickname katana killer for this Chinese weapon was given in the West, it didn't really catch on. After all, the United States and China have a unique relationship. Let's not forget, China is one of the few countries with direct military experience against the States, but that's a whole different story.